Welcome to The Next Journey, the adventure travel podcast with me, Andrew St. Pierre White. I'm a prisoner of this hill. Yeah, very well.
Now, is the image quality okay for you? Would you like me to be closer, wider?
Actually, yeah, you look very good. Very good. I'm not talking about you, I'm just talking about the lighting, of course.
No, I figured that. No, it's self-evident truth, mate.
Good, we're off to a good start.
That's
All
it.
right, no, you look fantastic. I'm recording it on a separate device. It goes online somewhere, it gets recorded onto the cloud. And after we've finished, I press stop, download all of the files, and then compile and edit. Hopefully it's working. Yesterday I tested it and it did. So, hey.
Well, if it's not, I'm happy to just go again because I understand how absolutely easily these things can just fall over at any time.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I was doing it live on Sunday, and it fell over, and it's like. I've just come back from Kennedy Space Center, and they've got all those, a billion consoles and 100,000 lights. And I thought, yeah, it's not unlike that, trying to get a live YouTube broadcast to go smoothly. So
yeah,
you
you
understand.
It's just like riding a bike, only the bike's on fire and you're on fire.
Exactly. All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Next Journey podcast. I was going to say good friend, but the fact is that we are friends, but we've never actually met. We've chatted and emailed and stuff for several years, but we've never actually met. This is actually the closest we've come to actually meeting.
This is our first voice-on-voice contact, I think.
It is. Actually, yes, I think everything else has been emails.
Yeah, we've had these sort of fractured conversations, if you like, by YouTube video and response and things of that nature. Yes. And we've talked in the comments feed, but we've never actually chatted like this. So it is a great honour, I'd suggest, to be invited onto one of the early episodes of this program by none other than His Excellency, the Governor General of Dingo Piss Creek. And I just hope that the automotive Antichrist can do your fine fledgling program justice.
Well, thank you for that accolade. I do repeat it, actually. I said, apparently I'm the Governor General of Dingo Piss Creek.
It's a great honour. I just wouldn't get a big head about it.
No, absolutely right. I've invited you, actually, because I think you and I share something, and that is that we bothly have, and I think in your words, as well as a few others, highly tuned bullshitometers. Absolutely. Especially when it comes to the motoring press.
Well, the motoring press is a really interesting phenomenon, and it's interesting to me because I've been part of it, and then I kind of divorced myself from that, which was like Dresden on the 15th of February, 1945, and then when you look at it from without, having been inside, it's a really interesting microcosm of sycophants and yes men, and there are good intentions bilaterally from car makers and from the motoring press, but to my estimation, the system itself is broken and it leads to bad outcomes for the consumer at the end of the journalistic product, whether it's a video or a story or a podcast or whatever, because journalists tend to self-censor any criticism because they want to be invited back and they don't really want to be on the receiving end of a whole bunch of commercial opprobrium from a car maker. And it's a very difficult balancing act. And I think the easiest party to throw under the bus here is the consumer who has tuned into the review or whatever else to try and get some sort of read on whether he should spend $50,000 to $100,000 on a particular new vehicle, which I think is a great shame.
Right. Okay. Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to ask you the ultimate question at the end of this. We're going to come to some kind of conclusion. And that is, I'm just going to go to our sponsors very quickly, but that is, how on earth do you find a review on a car that you can actually trust? So that's what we're going to get to in a minute. I'd like to say thank you to our sponsor for this show, egon.com.au. If you are building an overlanding caravan trailer 4x4, You're going to want to build an electrical installation. If you intend to do it yourself, then, well, that's a challenge in front of you. If you want to make that challenge a lot simpler, you use the Egon DC hub. No heat shrink, no crimps, no small fuse holders, no large fuse holders, no bus bar. It's all replaced with one unit where you connect everything, and connect everything with a capital E. All your chargers, all your batteries, all your accessories. And it will save you not just money, but a lot of time and heartache. That's egon.com.au. Right, John, that out of the way. The reason why I watch your show is because you're always digging deeper than your average motoring journalist. You recently did a feature on NCAP safety ratings. And while at the end of it you didn't say, and you didn't really point fingers because, well, you didn't point fingers saying they are dishonest, but at the same time you leaned back and said, I don't understand it. That car is actually weak in many safety features, and yet it's got the 5-star that all of the manufacturers are looking for. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, okay. So here's the problem with the 5-star safety rating. I appreciate that vehicle safety is a very complex issue and it involves a great deal of applied physics, and a lot of people are not geared up for that because of their education. They didn't go and submit themselves to an engineering degree, which I can tell you firsthand is a great way to bleed from the ears for 6 years at university just doing endless mathematics and physics. So they do have something of an uphill battle to fight because we're taking this extremely complex technical subject and trying to make it digestible. But the core message of the 5-star safety rating is that those vehicles offer best practice, excellent, whatever you want to call it, levels of protection for you and your family if you are involved in a crash. And when you drill down into it and you look at the technical report with 6 of the most recent 9 5-star, well, most recent ratings, there were 8 5-star ratings and 1 4-star rating, which were awarded in the last 9. 6 of those 8 cars that got 5 stars had marginal or weak survivability protection outcomes when you look at the technical report. One of them was a Mercedes-Benz. It offers weak protection to the thorax in the oblique pole test, which is where they slide the car at 45 degrees into an immovable post. And a weak protection outcome means, that's bad for the dummy, but hey, it's even worse for you if you find yourself in that horrible predicament where you've lost control of the car and the next thing coming up is like a 100-year-old gum tree. So I just find it amazing that the rhetoric says excellent levels of protection, whereas the reality says, but weak in this respect. So I'm not critical of them for dishonesty. I don't think they're trying to be dishonest. I just think the system needs a major tweak, which might involve a wrecking ball and a lot of rebuilding. And there are taxpayer funds on the line here. So to me, this is also an important issue. We're paying for this system, whether we like it or not, and we deserve the best return on investment we can get. And if they're going to be in the business of rating different vehicles in the context of their safety, then their system needs to be rated as well by external influences such as me, the automotive antichrist. And I'm sure they don't enjoy being rated in this way, but I think there's a powerful public interest case for that because, if I wanted to spend $100,000 on a new Mercedes-Benz GLC and I see that 5-star rating, I infer that means weapons grade protection for me and my family, when in fact, in some crashes, it absolutely doesn't.
It doesn't. I saw that and I was also quite surprised because you associate car manufacturer brands with safety. Mercedes-Benz is one of them. That's a big, tall, that's the GL. I think it was the GL that suffered those quite poor. Is that correct? That's the large GLC. SUV?
It's a GLC, but yeah, it's a car that costs $100,000 and it wears the 3-prong badge up the front. So there's there's an association that goes with that, and the reality of its performance in a crash is quite different in that oblique poll test.
All right. So you're basically you're not on a. Are you on a mission to? What is your mission, John?
Well, my mission isn't to make friends, because I think making friends is kind of overrated. I'm sort of with Winston Churchill on that. See, I had a look around at what motoring journalists do, and what they do is they try and fit in, because it's nice to swan around in the new cars and it's nice to go on the international launches. Like, in a sense, being a motoring journalist is the perfect job if you hate your life, because you can spend half of it in Europe and you don't pay for the travel, and it's all 5-star, right? It's business class and 5-star resorts, and the only problem is you've got to hang out with car company people and other motoring journalists, as opposed to, if you like your life, you'd probably want to do that with your family. So I'm not that motivated to be liked. I don't care if people dislike me either. The enemy in the media game, as I see it, is indifference in any case. So what I want to do is I want to have people react to the stories I do, but I also have to have integrity with that, because it's easy to make people react with bullshit. That happens all the time. Just watch politics in the United States or Australia, right? That's emblematic and endemic. So I want the facts to inform my stories, and in a sense, I'm kind of waging war on bullshit.
Waging war on bullshit. That's a great name for your channel. Actually, should be in a bracket. Waging war on motoring bullshit.
It's probably a violation of YouTube's whatever, using the word bullshit in the name of the channel. It's okay to use it when you're actually just chatting after the first 7 seconds. But
share with me one of your most memorable events, because you are a traditional motoring journalist. I used to do a lot of those too. Go to a soiree set up by the manufacturers to show their vehicles off in the best possible light, wine and dine. The journalists schmooze them. There's no end to the schmoozing, so that you come up with a nice review on a car, which sometimes is really very, very ordinary. Share some stories about some of the motoring events that you have attended.
I went to Florence once with Mercedes-Benz to drive the 500 SL. That was pretty memorable, because, who doesn't like a good trip to Florence and a nice drive around Tuscany in a 500 SL Mercedes-Benz? And we went to the opera that evening. And, you can get completely blasé about this sort of stuff. I've been to Sweden to interview a whole bunch of safety experts with Volvo a few years ago. And the never-ending parade of different places you can go as a motoring journalist is brain-bending. I think if you're a brickies labourer and you hear about the way it is for motoring journalists, like A-grade motoring journalists or A-list motoring journalists, then it doesn't seem like work, I'm sure, but there is a quid pro quo that goes with this stuff, and the expectation is that you'll write nice things. So there's kind of two things that go with that. Like, superficially, the car company wants to pretend that it's your friend. And I don't think a car company is the kind of thing you can be a friend with any more than you could be a friend of the earth. Because what are you going to do? Invite a car maker over for a few beers and a barbecue on a Saturday afternoon, or invite the earth over? You can't do that. So there is this sort of faux friendship on offer. And if you play the game, that's all you ever see, right? However, if you make the mistake of telling a few harsh truths about car maker conduct or the deficiencies in a particular product and they don't like it, then the other side of the equation kind of is played, and that is, we can't invite you on these gigs anymore. If you keep doing this kind of thing, you won't be driving our cars anymore. And I guess if that doesn't shut you up, then they can have a proper tantrum and threaten to pull their ads, which, if you're a journo, and let's face it, motoring journalists on staff don't make very much money. So if you're one of those and you're using your salary to pay your mortgage or your rent and feed your family, then when a car company has a proper tantrum and threatens to pull its ad from the publisher, that has direct financial ramifications to you, because the commercial director of your publishing operation will kind of have a meeting with the boss and say, we've got to get this clown in line, otherwise he's got to go, because he's going to cost us, in the case of a major car maker, it could be millions. So you've got to see these big gigs and these desirable gigs through the prism of what's really going on here. And it's really all about love us, and if you don't, here's your infringement notice.
So when people are reading a review on a car, they actually need to have that in the back of their minds, do you think? I'm trying to get to the bottom of how to...
I think they need to have it in the front of their minds, because here's the acid test, right? If you really just want to cut through to whether or not a review is biased or unduly positive, because the really insidious mechanism here is a journalist will sit there and he's writing a story and he knows what the car's like, but sometimes he gets to the point where he says, I've got to have a bit of a shot at this because it doesn't have this feature and all the others do, or because it really didn't impress me with the dynamics, or, it's got some objective deficiency compared with its line ball competitors. If that journo sits there and goes, what's the car maker really going to think about this? Then that's a huge problem, because he's censoring his content to keep the car maker happy. So my strong advice to you, if you're watching a video review of a car or you're reading some review on one of the major websites, is that if there's insufficient criticism of the product, then that's kind of a problem, because all products have deficiencies objectively, and they need to be pointed out if the review is going to be fair and balanced. And in this respect, the criticisms validate the praise. So there's going to be praise as well, like, oh, it's really good at this, handles great, it's so comfortable, I love the refreshing look of the interior, blah, blah, blah. Just a vomit stream of praise and compliments, right? If there's not the counterbalancing criticism, then the whole thing just reads and sounds a little bit bent over, and your radar should go beep, 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 like that, because if you're not getting told the full story, you probably shouldn't base your expensive decision about what to buy next on an incomplete set of facts.
Right, but there's another way of looking at that. I recently am building this Land Cruiser in South Africa, and there's a company, small company, that makes a very, very nice rear bar wheel carriers. Best I've seen anywhere. Very, very good. I've used them before. Last time I said all the good stuff because it's a really good product, and that's why I've asked for it again. But they had a reverse light on the back of it, and I said it was not even as bright as a glowworm in a jar, because it was pointless. But here's the thing. The viewers heard all my positive stuff and didn't really hang on the negative stuff, because it wasn't actually that consequential. It was just a reverse light, and they didn't think it through very well. But the rest of it was still fantastic. But the client on the new build, he said to me, yeah, do you want one for your new vehicle? I said, yeah, definitely. He said, but you can't say anything negative. And I said, well, deal's off, mate. Sorry, deal's off. Deal is off. Okay, off. I'll go and get something else. Honestly, I'll buy it for you. I'll buy it from you at full retail price, because I don't want to be accused of, you pandered. But at the same time, I said to him, mate, it was the reverse light. I understand that you've actually changed it anyway. So what you're doing is, by asking me not to say anything bad, you're devaluing the entire review.
Yeah, this is exactly true, because whatever criticism you level at a product, no matter how minor, because you love the rear wheel carrier but the reverse light sucked a bit, then that tells the viewer of your review that you're not bent over, because that small little nugget of criticism validates the praise. And what I'd expect from somebody like you with vast experience touring in remote places is you would pre-select quality products off the bat. So you wouldn't go and have some piece of shit installed on your vehicle, because then it would drive you nuts. And the implementation and the execution of the modifications that you've done to achieve your objective, which would be make it better and more suitable for that kind of touring, you'd be shooting yourself in the foot off the bat. So your products would be pre-selected by virtue of your expert experience at doing exactly this kind of thing. And therefore, they wouldn't warrant too much criticism, because one would hope that you'd learned how to select the best products to do that kind of stuff in your capacity as the Governor General.
Yes, that is the principle. For somebody actually reading that review and listening to that view, if you're hearing nothing negative, then the alarm bells should ring. Okay, fair enough. In your experience, where you've done reviews, what have the reactions been to the good versus bad stuff that you've presented about a product or a car or whatever?
Well, I see a pretty worrying trend in. When you say reactions, do you mean audience reactions or corporate reactions?
Both.
Okay, so the most worrying trend with audiences, I think, is tribalism, because there's, for example, with electric cars, which is a really passionate topic in society, or motoring society at the moment, the whole electrification thing in a subsection of people has become almost like a religion, i.e., they're believers and they take it very personally if you criticize what they believe in. So I think that kind of tribalism is really worrying, because it tends to push the facts under the table. Like if you say, I said recently that there's no recycling mandate for lithium-ion batteries, and that's going to be a big problem into the future, like an Erin Brockovich kind of problem, because you don't want lithium hexafluorophosphate getting into the groundwater. That's generally regarded as bad, So in the absence of a mandate, we need there to be a strong commercial case. Otherwise, the free market will not recycle the batteries. So if you point this out, the tribal group in the audience will view that as an attack on their religion. Whereas I would have thought if you'd bought an EV for all the right reasons, for example, then you'd be concerned about the environmental impact of that at the end of its life. And you'd be possibly wanting to sprint to the front of the queue and advocate strenuously for a recycling mandate, because you bought that car for environmental reasons and you really care about what happens to it. So environmentalism is just one aspect of it, but you get tribalism in kind of all camps. And this has the capacity to fracture the epistemology of reality and just weaponize people's confirmation biases. And it kind of means the facts don't matter anymore. So that's the biggest worry I've had there. And the interesting thing about car company reactions in particular is that I used to get a lot of reaction from car makers when I worked on Wheels magazine, for example. I had a woman who used to ring me up all the time from Holden, and it was her job to point out every deficiency, seemingly, that was ever in any story I did relating to a Holden. And so much so that when her number flashed up on my phone, I'd just say, "Hello, person from Holden, what have I got wrong this month?" kind of thing, And now that I've divorced myself from this roundabout, that doesn't happen anymore. I don't get very much communication from car companies that A, calls me a bastard, or B, says, "Hey, dude, you got that wrong." So deafening silence is the way the car makers sort of treat people like me. They don't want to engage because presumably they don't want to open the floodgates of hell. And it's also a bit compounded in Australia because a car maker, like a large corporation with more than 10 employees, can't sue for defamation under Australian law. So you can kind of say what you want about corporations, as long as you don't make it about the people within them, you're on reasonably safe ground from a defamation lawsuit point of view. So I think the PR people in car companies are much more interested in developing a sinister little clutch of sycophants that they can lead around on a chain and take from event to event, so that when the PR person's performance is assessed higher up by the CEO or something, or the marketing director, they can say, well, look what I've achieved. Here is this litany of just fantastic, clean praise that everyone just delivers like clockwork because they're our friends in the media.
I was going to ask you that question, but you kind of answered it for me. When I did a couple of pieces on the record of Toyota, and as you know, I'm a big fan of the Toyota 70 series and everything, and I admit it. Okay, I am probably biased towards that vehicle because I use them and I like them, etc., etc. But the Toyota Corporation, I couldn't care less. And when those warranty claims came up, which honestly, frankly, the first one with the wheel, the brakes was just absurd. I know for a fact that people right high up in Toyota saw it. And the dealer principal from the dealer that I often go there and film, and they don't pay me or anything to do it. I just do it because they're nice people. And he will kind of look at me and said, "This week, yeah," and we saw it. And I got a phone call from head office, and I said, "So, are you going to do anything about it?" He kind of said, "Well, maybe." And of course, he had to hedge his bets. Of course, he did, but nothing, absolutely nothing. And the recent one was, you've got corrosion on your aluminium cased gearbox housing, which actually was Australian red dirt. There's a lot of it in this country, and they weren't going to warrant. And then they suddenly called me and said, "No, we'll." But did they call me to say, "It's fine, Andrew, you don't have to pay the fee, the $180 fee for our inspection, because we will take it as a warranty claim"? Did they do it because, oh, crikey, it's bloody Andrew White? Shit, we better do something now. Or did they do it and say, no, that's actually not reasonable? I suspect it was the former.
Yeah, I suspect it was the former too. In fact, I'd put the house on it. Like, they would want to hose you down so that you didn't, just keep vomiting on about it. But I watched that report of yours with some interest, and it was just laughable that by corrosion they meant red dirt stained on. You hadn't even done too many water crossings. It's not like you'd been. It's not like you'd been this far up the A pillars in water, right? I saw the crossing you did on the Canning Stock route, and it was like an inch and a half of water if you were lucky.
We could walk. I know.
Grandmother in a Zimmer frame could have overtaken you on the crossing had she had the big enough, low pressure in the tyres, sort of thing.
Yes.
The interesting thing about car makers that I get is occasionally, like, I actually am on reasonably good terms with a bunch of technical people at various car makers who talk to me off the record from time to time, and they'll even say to me things like this. They'll go, "Oh, mate, we love your stuff as long as it's not about us," kind of thing, because they kind of love it when you give it to brand C over here. They don't like copying it themselves. And I get that they don't like it, because if you are, for example, the product manager for Land Cruiser 300 in Australia, and I don't have any contact with Toyota, they hate me. But if you are that guy, you basically sell your soul to Toyota and you work really hard, and you've got the most hateful balancing act of all time, because you're at war with the factory and you're at war with the marketing manager in Australia because they want this, but the commercial guys don't want to pay for all of that, and the factory is hardlining you about how much all of that's going to cost. So you're fighting this battle on multiple fronts, and it's completely consuming. And many of the perceived deficiencies of products that the likes of you or I might drive are down to the compromises that are made in this process, right? So if you are that product manager, you've slogged your guts out to make that vehicle the best vehicle that it can be in the circumstances, with all those extant constraints around it. And having its deficiencies pointed out is a bit, it guts you. And if you cared about your job, it could not gut you. But it doesn't mean that the criticisms are not valid, and it doesn't mean that the criticisms are not appropriate to tell somebody who might have $100,000 to drop on a new Land Cruiser or something. They need to know what the deficiencies are. And if you're sitting there going, "Oh, I need to be everyone's friend," then frankly, you're just in the wrong job, dude.
Yeah, I should come and do what we do.
Yeah, totally. Like,
Yeah.
I think there's a lack of appreciation in the public and with journalists about just how hard it is to make a car right, and how many of the impediments to making a car better just come down to it's money, and the factory. Like, we're not all good friends inside car makers. The product guys hate the factory guys, and the factory guys hate the product guys, and the marketing guys hate the product guys, and it's a cesspool of hatred. And miraculously enough, some decent cars fall out from time to time.
Yeah. Interesting. So I'm listening to your words about personal attacks. You'll present an argument, and I'll listen to it, and I'll think, yeah, that's worth thinking about. I don't necessarily agree with him, but it's worth thinking about, because now you've mentioned, Nissan or Subaru, and I'm a Nissan Subaru baby. I'll suddenly find a personal attack. Oh, John is this. Instead of attacking the argument, they'll attack the person presenting the argument, and it drives me up the wall. If you've got something valuable to say about what I'm presenting, go for it. I'm all ears. I will genuinely listen and think. Sometimes it'll be rubbish, and other times it'll be, that's an interesting take. Not if you're going to call me a name. This must have happened to you 100 times.
100 times a day, Andrew. I mean, look at
okay, share some of the goodies.
The comments feed is. I really feel for younger creators on YouTube. I really do, because I've got extremely thick skin. Like, I fundamentally don't care what somebody says. Somebody I don't know, like Blue Man 222. Do we really care what he says if it's a personal attack? Like, not really. And the bigger problem is that there's a lack of critical thought. Right? Because if I present an argument to you and it's got a hole in it, then rather than call me a bastard for highlighting some perceived deficiency in the Subaru that you love, and it's the 25th Subaru that you've owned, and it's the best damn car ever, kind of thing, and therefore I'm a bastard for alleging that it's not. Why not just concentrate on the facts? Right. And this is a real problem in society at the moment, because we're kind of avoiding critical thought and fact-based arguments, and people feel as if they're entitled to their opinion. And I don't think anybody, me, you, anyone who listens to or watches this podcast, is entitled to an opinion for which they can't argue. And by that, I mean, if you can't dredge up facts that absolutely stand up to independent scrutiny to prosecute your point of view, then you're just making shit up. And it can be compelling to you, but you shouldn't inflict it on the rest of the world unless you've got some facts to back it up. It's like, there's a ship in the Netherlands at the moment with 6 or 8 cargo decks burned out, and there are 500 EVs on it, and all the news reports at the time said this fire is so severe and so hard to fight because of the presence of these EVs. And I get, for example, that you can be really pro-EV, but just saying I'm a bastard for pointing this stuff out, that's not an argument to do we need better safety standards for the deployment of electric vehicles in conventional ro-ro shipping or in underground car parks in Perth or Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane.
Can you think of any real juicy ones worth repeating with the people that had a go at you, where it's just nonsensical but very funny?
Actually, I do, episode after episode of reacting to the most nutty comments, but I just can't bring them to mind off the bat.
Do you reply? Do you answer, reply, or do you leave it alone?
I know I do. I do YouTube episodes of reaction to these to these nutbag comments, and the funniest thing about them is occasionally I get accused of making them up, and they're all authentic. Like some of them I couldn't make up. I don't have what it takes to make this nutty stuff up. It's brilliant. It's a kind of confluence of Dunning-Kruger syndrome and lack of technical education and functional illiteracy. But sometimes it's like when you get, a million chimpanzees in a room, each with a laptop. occasionally one of them's going to belt out the New Testament. You know what I mean? And that's kind of
Do you get?
that's kind of where I'm coming from
Are
with the
you
comments.
are you tempted to insult back by just simply telling them where to put the apostrophe?
Oh,
Just
often. But where would you
yeah.
stop if you opened that door? You just turn into a black hole of responding to Redman 357. Like if you rang me up, or if you did an episode that said I spoke about something in relation to driving off road or towing and I got this wrong, then I'd listen to that because A, you're not some anonymous tool. And I know that you've got runs on the board. And if I made a mistake, I'd want to know about that and correct it. But the comments feed is a cesspit from time to time. And I don't think the comments feed is necessarily representative of the audience broadly either, because you get a lot of comments that say, I can't believe some of these people in the comments feed.
You're right, right. So I want to bring up a subject that you and I. Altercation is the wrong word because it was very well meant. Everything was very well meant. I presented a proposal, and you said, Andrew, sorry, mate, bullshit. And the proposal was, if you remember it rightly, was are air intercooler scoops the wrong way round? And I proposed the idea. I didn't say they were the wrong way round. I proposed the idea that are they the one way round? Because at the moment, if you take a bonnet scoop, for example, and most of them are under bonnet or over bonnet scoops, that the air goes high pressure area in front of the vehicle, air goes through the engine, now through the scoop and through the intercooler, and the air is then let to do what it, there's no ducting or anything aft side, lee side of the intercooler. And I suggested that if you actually turned the scoop, bonnet scoop, specifically bonnet scoop, around, then the air is going to come through, and actually behind the bonnet scoop, there's going to be a little low pressure area, which is actually going to suck air. So you're going to have a high pressure area. So you're going to get a faster flow of air through the intercooler, because obviously the more air you can pass through the intercooler, the more efficient it's going to be to transfer the heat, logically. And I came up with this. Well, it wasn't my idea. It was actually a guy, ex-rally. He used to build rally cars, and he has a very, very potent turbo diesel Hilux. And he has the scoop the other way around. And he's been playing with this, and he says, works better with the scoop the other way around. And I proposed that question. And you had a good go at me. And I still want to talk about it because you said, yes, but there's high pressure area. And do you remember that?
I do. I remember that. The principle of airflow through the cabin is based on a well of high pressure that exists in the region where the bonnet intersects with the windscreen, because obviously the air has to run into the windscreen and divert. So that's a relatively high pressure area there. And even though there's no, you just said there was no ducting on the lee side, there's a thing called CFD that they use in R&D in car makers. It's called computational flow dynamics. So what they do is it's a little bit like finite element analysis. They model individual particles of air on the way through various flow channels, and they just figure out how airflow works. But I'd suggest that the two problems with your hypothesis are that to get air, you're essentially talking about turning the rear facing scoop into an exhaust. Am I inferring that correctly?
Yes, basically the air would not go into the scoop and through the scoop into the intercooler and then dispersed over the engine. It would actually come through the front radiator grille of the car and upwards through the intercooler radiator and out through the scoop.
Yeah, okay. So there's a couple of problems with that. And the first problem is you'd have to fight the high pressure area between the bonnet and the windscreen. So
you mentioned that, but it's still a lower pressure area than the front grille of the car.
Okay, sure. it's a relatively high pressure area. It's
Yeah.
higher than 1 atmosphere because otherwise air wouldn't flow through the cabin when you turn the HVAC on. But the other slight problem with this is that the air that you've got coming through the intercooler would already be preheated by virtue of travelling through the air conditioning condenser and the radiator and whatever else. Presumably it'll also come past the exhaust headers and the hot engine block of the car. And there's a thing called Newton's law of cooling, which says that the effectiveness of a cooling system or the effectiveness of heat transfer is predicated on the temperature differential between two different regions. So if you've got hotter air, it doesn't do as good a job on the intercooler cooling the air down on the way through. And I guess there might be some particular cases where a rear-facing scoop is going to work better. There's an empirical dimension to that. But
you mentioned
there would be a reason why most scoops face forward.
You didn't mention that, and you're absolutely correct. If I think about it, because I was listening to your argument, and I was saying, but it's all relative. You get high pressure. It's high pressure. It might be a high pressure area, but it's still lower than, therefore air will flow. But the heat thing is an issue because you've got the radiator heat, the air conditioner, condenser, and then you've got the engine block itself.
Yeah.
So that air is going to be warmer, which is going to be less effective, obviously. Okay, well, I agree with you that, but what was great about that, and this is why I'm pointing it out, is that we had an argument, and we were talking about technical stuff. You have far more engineering background than I have. I don't have an engineering background. I think I'm quite intelligent when it comes to that, but there's so much about engineering that I don't understand. I have to assume certain things. So well done. It was a good discussion. I presented an idea and you machine gunned me down, but you did it in the right way. You said, but have you thought of this and this and this? And you start talking about technical things where I can lean back and say, yeah, not a great idea. Worth talking about around the campfire.
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole thing about respectful disagreement, like I'm all for disagreeing with people, right? But there are ways to disagree with someone, and the worst way of all time is to just, out of the blocks. You don't just call someone a cock because you disagree with them. You know what I mean? Like, that's a fail. You've got to say, no, hang on a minute. The way I see it, it's blah. It's kind of like the conversation I just had with you then, rehashing the whole which way should the scoop face deal. Because what I admired about your piece that you originally did on that was that you went through that in quite a common sense way, and you said, well, here are the goalposts as I see it, and if that is the case, then the scoop should face the other way. And I thought, well, that would mean that a whole bunch of people in a whole bunch of other car companies have just flat out got this wrong. And there's probably a reason why the scoop does face that way, and let's just look at what those facts might be about that. But you didn't just dream it up. Like, you had a logical thought process that led to this speculation about why the scoop should it face backwards. I think you posed it more like a question, if memory serves. But the reality is, no, I really don't think it should. And there'd be a few detailed problems with it as well, such as if you ever had any oily sort of misting that went on inside the engine bay, it'd continuously spray all over the windshield, which would get old every time it rained, for example. But I don't see that as the reason. Like in the olden days, around a campfire, we'd all have a 3-foot razor blade on our hip, and that's a real breeding ground for the development of diplomacy. Right? You've got to be polite and diplomatic and talk about the facts rather than make it personal, because the second you start making it personal, people's hands go down here onto the sword, and, an otherwise pleasant night around the campfire goes a bit Kill Bill, doesn't it?
Yeah. I was once chatting to somebody about you, and they said, yeah, mate, yeah, but he drives a Mitsubishi. And that was his sum total of the argument.
Hang on, one of the dudes that you drove down the Canning stock route did it in Triton, didn't
And
you?
I actually, that's one of the reasons why I actually said the best thing to do, the canning stock route, is a badly maintained 2013 Nissan Triton, because that's what he did it in. And he had a few minor issues which he sorted.
Well,
And
here's the thing about the Triton, right? Am I in love with it? No.
it,
Why did I buy it
yeah.
instead of a Hilux Rogue or one of those? Well, there's a small matter of $15,000 difference at the time in the price. And what do I actually use it for? Well, I moved stuff from this fat cave to my other fat cave, and it's kind of okay at that. Is it the best ute in Australia?
No,
No,
but
not even
yeah,
close.
yeah,
Right?
yeah.
But it does the job for me, and I'm not. Here's the other thing about being a motoring journalist for 30 years, right? This thing about being in love with the car you own, like, I don't get it. If somebody said to me tomorrow, would you like to come out to a racetrack and drive a 911 GT2 Porsche? I'd go, no, I'm a bit busy tomorrow. I'm just not in love with that stuff anymore. I mean, the first time I drove a Ferrari, right, I was so looking forward to it. And it turned into an emblematic case of sex with a supermodel syndrome. This was a 550 Maranello. And I picked it up and I'm going, yes, this is the first Ferrari, yes. And I got in it and I don't know, 15 minutes later, I'm going, I really thought it'd be better.
Really?
Like this whole tribalism thing about brands of cars and the Hilux Brigade and the Ranger Brigade and the Land Cruiser Brigade. Dude, they're just cars.
But they're not just cars. My argument is that they become something else. We've got three cars. We've got the Range Rover, which for the canning stock route, I don't have an emotional attachment to it. My first Range Rover that I bought when I was 20, I would have died for it. I would have gone to war for it.
Yeah.
It was so, maybe we just get older and smarter, but I don't think there's anything wrong with this Africa. I don't know if you've been watching the series, the Africa build. We bought this 500,000-kilometer Land Cruiser that had never had any love. Nobody loved that car, but they'd looked after it, but they hadn't loved it. So it was in quite reasonable shape mechanically, body shape, not great. Nobody loved that car. Did a bit of work, took it down all the way down to Cape Town, had a good time with it, rattling. We called it, it had been used as probably some kind of ambulance of some kind, I'm not sure. It had 8 seats bolted in the back, but they had been moved several times. When I took all the seats out, there were 107 holes that had been drilled in the floor pan. So I then gave it a name, and I called it Colin. Colin.
Perfect.
So
Perfect. Yeah.
But after that happened, I don't give names to my cars anymore. I used to, but I don't anymore. And suddenly I started really liking this car. Not loving, I'm not going to go to war for it, but I started liking it because it had a personality. Over only 2 weeks, it started having a personality, and that's the difference, I think.
I kind of look. I understand that absolutely. If you turn a car into a thing that becomes more than just transportation, then I get that it's part of your identity in some sense. There would be a lot of people who watch your channel who are just as enthusiastic as you, albeit in a recreational sense, to do the kind of off-road adventuring that you do. And for them, their vehicle, which they probably slave over fixing it up when they break something when they're out last weekend and getting it ready for breaking something next weekend kind of thing, or just enjoying the weekend away and the preparations that go with that. That's more than just transportation, right? That's part of your life. And I get that cars like that are more than just transportation. But the point I'm making about my Triton is it's just transportation. It's a good value ute, but am I going to be devastated if some alien in geosynchronous orbit teleports it away for investigations, for a bit of probing, and I never get it back? Then No, I'll just make an insurance claim and probably just go again with some similar but different vehicle. It's just
It's
a car.
because it's not part of your family. So once it's an appliance,
Oh
and
yeah, if the aliens took the dog, I'd be devastated.
yeah, absolutely,
It'd be War of the Worlds,
yeah, absolutely,
right?
yeah. That's the difference when a car becomes part of the family. Now, if I think about my early Range Rover, I kept it for almost 9 years, and eventually, when I let it go, it was literally go, you're free kind of thing. I am tired of lying underneath you, and you are dropping shit in my eyes, weekend after weekend, just to keep you running. I've finally had enough. So that was me saying to my children. I did not say this to my children. You're out of here. I did
Yeah.
not have to say that to my children, but it felt that way until the day it was. Now, it might have been part of the family. It was part of my life. It was the reason I do what I do. It wasn't. It was difficult seeing the guy drive it away, but after he'd driven away, we went and had coffee. End of
Yeah.
story, even though it had meant so much to me. So this Africa troop carrier, I'm really looking forward to seeing it next April. We're going to go up to Zambia with it, but yeah, I'm not going to fall in love with Colin, and I don't even. My current troop carrier, which is a star of the show, is a fantastic vehicle. I just announced that I'm probably going to swap it for the new 2.8 and take the risk with the new Land Cruiser.
You're going to go with the automatic.
Yeah, I am. I'm going with the automatic, mainly because of the automatic. So it's a bit of a risk. It's a risk I'm willing to take. Do you know the numbers on that video were ridiculous?
Yeah, sure. Because that it's one of those vehicles where its existence is so deeply entrenched in that niche of people who give a crap about that car. It's I can imagine that the retention would have been really high as well on that video. But I've got this hypothesis about you. It's just based on something I've inferred from watching you talk about, in particular, your troopy. And I think you're less in love with the troopy and more in love with the process of building it.
That's actually true. I
Yeah,
think I
'cause
actually even said that.
you have you?
On one of the videos, I actually said I'd love that process, and I know what a troopy is, and I know how to build the back end of it, and there are not going to be too many surprises. And yes, I'll tweak it and make it a little bit better, but who cares really? Well, actually, the viewers care on how I tweak it. I just love the process. But you're absolutely right. There's no emotional connection with a vehicle. I've just come back from a solo trip, and a couple of times, and this is what I say: four-wheel drive overlanders. You've built a great vehicle if you set up your camp, you walk away. If it's to look at the ocean or take a pee, it doesn't matter. You look back at your rig, your tent and whatever, chairs, and you go, shit, man, that's good. Just then you've built a good overlander. Then you've succeeded because you'll never build the perfect one.
Well, see, I think there's a lot of things in life where the process is here and the outcome is here, and they're divorced from each other, or at least they're just separate. Okay, they're related to each other because you can't have the outcome without the process, and there's no reason to go through the process without the outcome. It's a little bit like working out, okay, like exercise. People go, oh, I don't like exercise. Okay, join the club, dude. Like, exercise is something you tolerate or you endure to get an outcome, which is presumably, not dying 10 years earlier or something. And I don't see that it's possible to like the process because it's designed to be hateful. If it's not hateful, it's not exercise, right? And it's not going to do for you what you want it to do. It's a thing you've got to endure. And I think for some people, the building of a vehicle to go overlanding is a process that they endure, and they enjoy the outcome, which would be the vehicle to do that stuff with their life. Whereas I just got the sense from you, I didn't see the episode where you pointed this out, but I got the sense from you that that's inverted with you, where I'm sure you love the outcome, which is the overlanding, but I think I note a real enthusiasm in you for the process of building it, because you've done it so many times. You'd be the world's biggest masochist, or you're really into that stuff.
Yeah, it's actually both. It's actually very much both. And the interesting thing is that my build videos attract a lot more viewers than my expedition videos. and but I live the expedition. That's what I live for. So my end thing, I build and love the build, and it's good for business, etc. Okay, and then, but I always have in the back of my mind as I'm building it, where am I going? What am I going to do? Is this going to work for me when I'm out there in the bush? That's the ultimate goal for me. So,
Well, that whole lifestyle thing is really interesting to me because I've done a lot. Like, I know I have shots at it all the time, and I've made up this whole fake narrative about Dingo Piss Creek and the beard strokers around the campfire and towing their 3.5-ton vans and just gumming up the highway, sort of thing. But I've done a lot of off-road adventuring. I've been on the Canning Stock route and driven to Cape York and done the Gibb River Road a million times and been to some out there places with the likes of Les Hiddens, the Bush Tucker man, setting things up. And it really is interesting to me that for many people, the acquisition of the vehicle is really just a starting point. You know what I mean? And then there is so much on offer in the aftermarket domain. Like, where does it end? I'm sure if you dumped $100,000 on a Land Cruiser, you could dump another 100 on aftermarket this and that, no problem.
easily, yeah.
And making the right set of choices is, to me at least, it's extremely complex because when you buy a vehicle, you're just buying the clean skin vehicle, then that vehicle's basically gone through a whole R&D process where many of the fault modes have been identified and sidelined. Whereas the minute you start modifying it and you add these components from this dude over here and then you add these components from this dude over there, then what you're essentially doing is building a really advanced kind of prototype and introducing fault modes potentially that you don't know about. And then you're going to give it a shakedown run somewhere like, I don't know, well 33, which would be an interesting place to discover that you've made a catastrophically poor decision or set of decisions about which components to fit here and there. Like maybe you've decided to tow a trailer and well 33 is where reality bites and you discover that that's a bad idea, sort of thing. And that's part of, I guess, where I see the value of your build videos, because with the wealth of experience you've got doing that, hopefully you can head off a whole bunch of well-intentioned but cockamamie decisions that some poor bastard might make on the road to building his own thing to do a similar trip. And if he makes the right set of decisions, it's a comparatively enjoyable and not all that angst-ridden, horrible sort of disaster management thing at the end. Whereas, if you make the wrong decision, you're just setting yourself up for an expensive fall, aren't you?
Well, that's actually exactly why we set up the Overland Workshop. And the Overland Workshop talks about all of these things: building, operating, four-wheel drives, the whole thing, everything. I think there are 9 courses currently on that. And that was the idea, is because a lot of people don't, they'll go on a trip once a year. They'll do a 2-week or 3-week trip, and then they might do a couple of weekends out. And that's their overlanding life. But they love overlanding. So what do they do about overlanding during the rest of the year when they're working hard? They spend their money on some kit and they add it to their rig, and they're overlanding, because then they invite the mates around and say, look what I've just added to my rig. They're busy doing the thing that they actually love doing. So they manage to stretch overlanding through the entire year by building bit by bit by bit by bit. And then the culmination is a trip. And you know what the first thing they do on the trip is? They sit around the campfire and they discuss what they're going to put on next. And that's the discussion around the campfire.
Okay, so here's, at the risk of flipping this whole podcast on you and asking you a bunch of questions.
Yeah, you're interviewing me now.
Yeah, it's probably
it's okay, I don't mind.
The terms and conditions that we signed up to originally. But I've got this hypothesis about your average overlanding dude, right? And this process of accessorizing the vehicle, okay? And I get exactly what you just said. And there's the likes of ARB and TJM and everyone else can absorb whatever budget you've got, and come back when you've got some more money to spend with this kind of thing. But you've got a person who's got whatever amount of off-roading experience, and they buy a vehicle, like they buy a Hilux Rogue or something, and they think at the outset about what am I going to do to it, Whereas I suspect that many of those people, the weakest link when it comes to off-roading is actually them. It's their ability at driving in all-terrain sort of conditions. Because I've driven a ton of standard vehicles in ridiculously challenging places, and they kind of go okay. But
yes,
you have to
yes,
you have to treat yourself, I think, as one of the components on the vehicle, and you can tweak your own sort of performance and get a lot more out of the vehicle. And I actually think one of the most cost-effective tweaks you can do for overlanding is just training yourself to be a better off-road driver.
yeah, but you can't show that off. You see, I watch these off-road shows, and they want to. Some of them are not one of those guys that with rock music. No, all right.
Yeah.
The slower, if you can do it, and I love doing that actually with people around, and I'll see a couple of cars going up like flat out of hell, and I'll think to myself, I could probably do that at a quarter of the speed. I actually don't even want to hear the engine. I might make a cock up and look stupid, but if I can get over that obstacle with making no wheel spin, I'll make them all look like Charlies. It works 50% of the time. That's a kick, actually. Making no noise at all. Absolutely nothing. Just drive through the obstacle.
You've probably got a different playlist on at the time too. A little bit less AC/DC and a little bit more just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Overlanding and forward driving has become the love of my life, and I do it all the time, and obviously make shows about it. But I don't get tired of it. I just did a trip now, a solo trip, and every now and again I need this isolation fix where I can actually just free my brain up with. I do not, and I will not buy a Starlink. It'll ruin everything.
Yeah.
What is the point?
But you're talking about an isolation fix and it being relaxing and that too. I think what most people don't realise about what you do is that you're actually wearing quite a few hats when you do that. And it's quite difficult to drive in challenging conditions and talk and make sure that you didn't botch the focus and the white balance and that the lighting's okay and the exposures are right. Like this stuff is another layer of complexity just on top of driving. And I think that's quite underrated by the people who watch your stuff, because I do that kind of thing all the time too. And it's just very difficult and easy to get wrong. Like, how many shots do you end up binning because you got some technical glitch and they're unsalvageable? Or how many takes do you have to go at a particular thing that you need to nail? Like, I don't know about you, but I throw a fair few ones and zeros in the bin before I pump a video out.
I bin stuff because the audio doesn't work. That's 90% of the time. If there's a problem, it's going to be with the audio. Okay.
Yeah.
And then occasionally because I don't have a film crew, I don't have nobody monitoring the audio, and also I rely on autofocus systems, which are marvelous until the one time you don't do a take two and there's no audio. So, and you haven't done a take two, so you have to, in the edit suite, come up with a plan. But I understand where you're coming from.
I'm a little like you with the autofocus, though. Autofocus in modern cameras, particularly Sony cameras, like I'm using a Sony camera for this. Like,
me too.
Me too.
Me too.
I would never. giving the audience motion sickness now, nerding out about autofocus, but I would never have trusted autofocus. Like 5 years ago, you've got to be kidding.
No.
And now, autofocus should be right.
You just make a mark in the sand. Focus, make a mark in the sand, and don't walk beyond the sand. Now, walk around, look at the camera, and it's amazing. Absolutely astonishing. So, in terms of presenting, I rarely write a script. I'll just, and sometimes I'll say, "Oh, that sounds interesting," and then I'll record it, and then the edit bench, I'll think, "Man, that was boring," and that'll bin. But in the recent one, the solo trip, basically was an invitation to. It was basically an invitation to the audiences. Come with me, sit in the car with me, and sit around the campfire. There's nobody else around. I've got nobody else to talk to, so I'll talk shit to you. And that's the whole thing. And amazingly, I think people are going to love it. And it's just me talking crap.
It's got to be the right flavour of crap, though. I mean, it's got to be turd of Great Dane. You don't just want some mongrel.
Well, I talk about the cameras and I talk about what it's like travelling alone. And then after a day or 2 or 3 of remote travel, I suffer from what I call benign insanity. I start being extremely silly. And I've actually got some clips of some of the old stuff that I've done. Some when I crossed the Kalahari, I went mad. One day I went completely bonkers, and of course I would roll camera, and I looked like a complete imbecile. But it's quite funny, even if I look back at now, and I can say, I know what was happening to my brain. So lonely, so long. Love being on my own. Don't make no mistake. But then I start being silly, and I just let the camera roll. And I think most people will think it's humorous, and those people that don't, well, they'll go and watch something else.
Well, you don't have to please everyone, but the interesting thing about being isolated for some period of time is that it's very rare for anybody in our society to experience that. And when you are in the company of other people, there's tremendous pressure to conform and behave in particular ways. And I guess you're just experiencing that the liberation of being able to be, briefly functionally insane without earning the opprobrium of those around you, or being sectioned briefly and subject to a psychological evaluation.
But the great part about solo travel is also that you actually have nobody to look after you. You're not responsible to anybody else but you. So you look after yourself. I go into a really remote place, so I know if something goes pear-shaped, I could be in trouble. So don't let it go pear-shaped. Just and so that thought process is also, for example, don't leave the car doors open. And I remember the first time I did a really challenging off-road solo trip was in the Kalahari, and I left all the car doors open, because it was a habit of mine. It was not a good habit, but it was a habit. And then a lion appeared. So I'm now climbing in the car, and I've got my tongue in my throat, and I'm breathing heavily. The first thing I did, as he roared, he was really close. And when I say really close, like the other side of the table, close. And I just leaned over. It was pitch black, and I leaned over, and I just turned the camera on. So the first thing I did is I just rolled camera. And it was lying on the seat of the car, but it was recording sound. I then got in the car, pointed the camera at myself, and thought, all the doors are open. All of them. Back, side, all of them. They're all open. So now, in Australia, I go and do a remote trip. I'm constantly closing those damn doors because I keep leaving them open. But what happens, I'm on my own, and a big brown, long, thin brown thing decides to get some warmth inside the car. I've got a problem. So don't let it happen. So that's also a nice thing you have to do when you're on your own. You have nobody else to worry about except yourself. But because you're on your own, you really have to look after yourself. I kind of like the buzz, to be honest.
Yeah, I see the opposite of that in society all the time. Like, a lot of people live their lives and they got jobs and recreational pursuits where there are no potential consequences, and if something goes wrong, they can always look for somebody else to blame, kind of thing, and the process of being accountable is missing in a lot of people. Like they always want to look for some other thing to blame. Car crashes are a classic case of this. They'll say the brakes just locked up, or the car went out of control. Cars just don't go out of control, right? They kind of don't. And
you lost control.
Yeah, and being accountable or being responsible for the consequences of your actions and stopping bad shit from happening to you is a real life skill that I think more people should learn. Like, if you're in here and you're welding, it's a really nice idea if you don't blow yourself up or burn the joint to the ground, and you're not going to have anyone to blame except yourself if that happens. And, if you're standing in front of a lathe and whatever you put in the chuck manages to jump out of the chuck and head for your snout, that's a bad outcome as well, right? And therefore, the principal countermeasure for all of this stuff is just make sure that doesn't happen, and that's kind of exactly what you're talking about with the remote travel. Like, you can't look for a scapegoat. If something goes wrong, you're in it, you'll have to deal with it. And the best countermeasure is just organize things so that that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
completely with you on that.
Yeah. It's actually really, yeah, it's, as I said, I get a bit of a buzz from it. And I was actually sitting, I'd made a little fire. I cooked something. I was leaning back in my chair. I was looking up. I hadn't seen anybody for 3 days. And I looked up and I saw this very, very clear satellite, very bright. And that's the space station. It's distinctly brighter than most satellites. And I thought to myself, the camera wasn't rolling, but I thought the closest human beings to me right now are those guys up there. Guys and girls up in that space station are closer to me than anybody else, because they're 125 something miles above the surface of the Earth, approximately, the space
I
station.
think it's about 200 Ks,
It's
something
about
like
200
that.
Ks.
Yeah.
So the town that I had left was 400 kilometers behind me, and the closest town was about 350 ahead of me. But it wasn't really a town; it was just an intersection. So I figured they might be shit. Bugger me, that's amazing. They're not going to be able to help me if shit goes down right now. I do carry, and I never used to, a personal locator beacon, and I also have a sat phone. The main reason for the sat phone is just to phone, go in and say, I'm good, I'm all right. That's the main reason for it. And of course, in an emergency, I could use it. My first crossing of the Kalahari, I decided I actually want, and this is where the lion came. You know that expression, blood runs cold? That's where it came from. Whoever came up with that expression had been in my situation, because the blood just literally just drained. I mean, when I say literally, it sort of felt like there was no more blood in my brain. It was just this shiver of, anyway, I had no personal locator beacon and no sat phone. And the reason for it was this: I wanted to, because after the lion had left, I was sitting there going, that was when the fear came afterwards.
Yeah, in a stressful situation, you don't really have time
To
for
get
fear.
no,
Generally,
you
there's
act.
a thing in neurology called an amygdala hijack. Your amygdala is like your fight or flight response thing in your brain. There are two of them. They're about as big as a walnut, and they basically they take your when you have an amygdala hijack, things like fear just not possible. Your IQ just falls off a cliff and your body gets flooded with cortisol and noradrenaline, and your fine motor control goes and your peripheral circulation shuts down. And it's just generally a fairly crap feeling that you have in the moment. But it's a big chunk of evolutionary program, because all of our ancestors, well, a great many of our ancestors were better at dealing with things like, oh yeah, that's a lion in the back of the vehicle again, kind of thing. And they had exactly that kind of reaction, and they got to pass on their genes to the next generation in the way that people with inferior reactions didn't. And we're very insulated from that kind of reaction in our modern sort of safe society, and people don't often experience that kind of thing. I guess you do if you get mugged or something of that, or you get injured, you get hit by a car or something. But generally, that kind of thing doesn't happen to people. And I think that's why so-called adrenaline junkies jump out of planes and go rock climbing and things of that nature.
Yeah, they need that fix. And I just wanted to find out what it would be like to be isolated, but not just isolated, utterly isolated. No way of contacting anybody in any way, period. And I wanted to feel like what that felt like. And it was quite strange, because I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. No matter where I was, stop the side, nice place to camp, nice tree. I can hang the shower up from the tree, and I look around, and constantly looking around to see, And I remember once walking onto a salt flat. I was completely on my own. And I walked about a mile onto this massive, you can't actually see the horizon. It's that big. And I walked and walked, and I kept stopping and turning around. Who's going on? And I would walk a bit more. What was happening was the rustling, because there was no wind. The rustling of my shirt was deafening because there was no other sound. So I could hear my shirt and I could hear my footsteps like 5 frames later, or 5 frames. It was out of sync. And I kept on thinking. Eventually I thought, this is my adrenaline sport. And eventually I actually turned back to the car because, all right, I've got my fix. I'm going back to the car, And I did the same thing with my daughter many years later. We went for a long, long walk onto a salt flat, and we were together, and we went out at night. And I did not turn a light on the campfire, and we walked out at night. And I said, right, Kate, which way are we going back? And she suddenly so tell me which way we're going to go. We're going to walk whichever way you say. That's how we're going to get back. And she said, I have absolutely no idea. None. I said, okay, well, did you notice anything when we left? I said, well, I actually pointed it out to you. It was the Southern Cross. I pointed it out to you before we left, but I didn't mention why I was pointing it out to you. So where is it? There it is there. I said, so which way are we going to walk? We're going to walk that way. I said, okay. So there's a long shoreline, and we are parked there. Where do we want to? We want to arrive back at our tent. How do we make sure we arrive back at the tent? She says, I have no idea. I said, the way to get back to the tent is to get it wrong. What are you talking about? I said, okay, there's a coastline, and there we are. If we think it's in that direction, let's walk in that direction, knowing that by the time we arrive at the shore, our camp will be on our left. We walk to the shore, turn left, and we will find our camp.
Yeah, that's a classic navigational strategy.
She just loved it. She loved that. It's so simple.
Yeah, aiming off's a really good way to do it. It's a lot of helicopter pilots do that too. They'd because you're always sort of estimating the wind direction and figuring out about what adjustment you've got to make to your course so that the wind carries you. You drift with the wind, and then you kind of aim in a particular way. And if you overcorrect for it, then you know that your objective is going to be downwind. It's exactly the same thing that you just described. I know many of your viewers would probably regard you as the greatest off-road adventurer ever, but I've actually had the privilege of interviewing, and by that I mean having a very brief conversation once, with the greatest off-road adventurer of all time.
Mm-hmm.
And he only drove 17 kilometres, right? And he was faced with a similar navigational strategy or a navigational challenge, not dissimilar to the one confronting your daughter that night. And do you want to hazard a guess about who he was?
Tom Shepard?
David Scott. Ringing any bells?
No.
Okay,
no, I know Chris Scott. I know Chris Scott's a very well-known overlander.
Yeah, well, David Scott was the mission commander of Apollo 15. He was the first man to drive the lunar rover on the moon.
You're cheating. You're right. He is.
Yeah, greatest off-road adventurer of all time.
Only did 11 miles. Yeah, okay.
Doesn't matter how many Kalaharis you cross, does it? Right.
Yeah.
So, and it doesn't matter how many thousand Ks you drive along the Canning Stock route. You can't top that.
But he did have a sat phone.
Well, he did, quite an advanced one. But the thing is, they went over the horizon in the lunar rover, and so they couldn't see the landing module, right? And the moon doesn't have a magnetic field.
I was going to say, compass ain't going to work. Yeah, carry on.
That's exactly right. I said to him, how did you find the landing module? Because you're on the clock. You've only got a fixed amount of air, blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, we followed our tracks. We sure have that.
That's the first thing I was thinking. What else would you do but follow your tracks?
Yeah. The other thing he did, which would probably interest you from a driving point of view, was that they'd practiced driving that thing extensively on Earth. And then when they pulled it out of the landing module and drove it around for the first time, his mission was a geology mission. And so they were collecting all these samples. So they pull up on this plane that's on like a 15-degree slope, and he applies the handbrake and puts it in park kind of thing. And it's like a scree type slope. They get out and they do their fossicking, and they look around like this, which is quite the challenge in a spacesuit. And the lunar rover is starting to slide down the 15-degree slope because it's like on ball bearings, and we're at 0.2 G.
And said, it only weighs a couple of kilos.
I said, dude, what did you do? And he said, well, I learned how hard it was to sprint in a spacesuit. And then the bastard, right? This is the classic setup, the setup to end all setups. He said to me, would you like to have a drive of the lunar rover? And I went, of course, dude. And I'm seeing the business class flight to the Kennedy Space Center, right? And someone meeting me and saying, well, this is the only remaining lunar, and you drive it like this. And I go, yeah, of course, dude, of course. And he goes, no worries, just get yourself there. We left the key under the seat.
Good one. I actually did a show about in the US, and I said that the Americans have left the world behind when it comes to aviation and blah, all the great thing Americans do and everything, but not in overlanding, except, of course, cuts to lunar rover. If you talk about this guy, the ultimate off-road machine.
It's an amazing vehicle in so many ways too. And anyway, he was just an amazing guy, and he's kind of the poster boy for what you were just saying about being accountable for this and that, because you don't get much more isolated than being on the moon, I think it's fair to say. And also, if something goes wrong, you've got to deal with it. And the way they were just accountable, I said to him, well, what happened? You know, if you were 9 k's away from the landing module and the rover crapped out, what were you going to do? And he said, no, we're probably going to die. And I go like this, and he goes, well, we just accepted these risks all the time in Apollo. And as the various risks went, you know, we had life support in our suits, and the lunar rover had life support. And if we ran out of that, we'd die of suffocation, but it's probably not a bad way to go in the circumstances with all things considered. And I went, okay, well, that's pretty matter of fact. But all of those guys were fighter pilots, and they were test pilots, and they diced with death for decades before they got into spacecraft. So
yeah,
just amazing when you consider the outlook of somebody like that in comparison to the outlook of many modern people in our society who don't take any risks, and therefore I think don't realise too many rewards either. Like, a lot can happen to you in the middle of the Kalahari, I'm sure, or in the middle of the Canning stock route, but if you manage those risks well, you come back and you've had a real adventure, and you've got something you can be well pleased with, I'd suggest.
Yeah. Again, part of Overland Workshop was we talk about risk and mitigating the risk. And in fact, a lot of people will say what you do is very risky. So no, it's not actually that risky, because I understand the risks. As soon as you understand the risks, you're going to obviously do something about them, and therefore the risks, they're not eliminated, but they're reduced in their severity to the point where chances of anything like that happening are actually very low. But if you go and without that information, yeah, sure, it's risky. But for me, it's not risky.
Well, I don't think we appreciate what risk is. Like, here's something really risky you can do, right? Just cross the road like that.
John is now holding his cell phone up, obviously looking intently at its screen.
That's really risky. And the reason you're not scared shitless by it is because you do it every day, or just standing on the side of the road with cars hurtling past you at 70 k's an hour. If you got a real adventurer like Magellan or someone of that nature, and you reanimated him and you put him next to a major highway with cars rocketing past at 70 kilometres an hour, he'd probably have a different view on that than the people who, from the modern world, are just completely blasé about it and do it every day.
It's been a great chat, John. Thank you very much for your time. Those of you who don't know John Cadogan from autoexpert.com.au. How do you say it? .com.au. He says it faster than anybody can say .com.au in the world.
autoexpert.com.au, like that.
Something like that, yes.
Well, it's look, thank you for inviting me onto the podcast, Andrew. And if we haven't cured everybody's insomnia, I'd be happy to come back and be your first return guest down the track once you've exhausted the hordes of people who are doubtless queuing up to be part of the show.
Hundreds they're beating down the door. So what we should do, though, I'd like the podcast is anecdotal. I don't want to use it as an education platform. I want to use it as a entertainment platform, because great stories. I've just interviewed somebody who's the first man alive to row a boat from mainland Australia to mainland Africa. First guy, unsupported. Just interviewed him last week, and that's going to be number 1 on the podcast. Amazing. And what a story! It's brilliant. And so I'm looking for stories, and I'm sure you've got, so your motoring journalist career. I'm going to finish with a quick story, and if you come up with something that you remember, please. We don't have a time limit here. I went to the launch of the Discovery 2. The first one was traction control, which didn't work terribly well. So traction controls on the 3 and 4 were brilliant. On the 2 were kind of test beds, and they didn't really work terribly well. And the 1 had none. And they had built a track, perfect wheel articulation, so the vehicle looked impressive, so that the Discovery 2 with its traction control could drive through it with the occasional bit of wheel spin, but it would get through. And at the end of it, lots of press people around. I went to the guy who was running it, and I said, his name was Tim, and I said, Tim, would you mind if I need to get a full picture of how good this system is, because it's very impressive. Okay, it's very impressive. I can see it's very impressive. I want to drive that car over the same track. And I pointed to a Discovery 1, no traction control. And he said, Andrew, yeah, look, mate, yes, but please wait until we're all having drinks. You and I go and drive it together. And I drove the Discovery 1 with far less wheel spin than the Discovery 2. And just by using some skill sets that I had, that's all I was doing. So they had set it up so it was so impressive that they actually brought that same Discovery 1 out during the presentation and purposely completely cocked up the driving. So the thing was sitting there going with a 1 front and 1 back wheel spinning. And the Discovery 2 would just romps over it. Aren't we great? And all of the journalists said, oh, well, wonderful. And so I went and did, and I said, well, just take your foot off at that moment instead of putting your foot on, and just turn down the slope very slightly and watch what happens.
Yeah, but see, in that situation, you are the traction control, right? And the thing that I observe about all of these electronic systems is that they're reactive, okay? Which means that traction control can only intervene when wheel slip occurs, when it's even incipient, okay? It doesn't have to be like wheel spin for 10 seconds and then it intervenes, but there has to be an incipient wheel slip activation before the traction control can detect it and intervene. Otherwise, there's no basis for intervening.
Yes.
Whereas if you're a half-decent driver, and so many of these electronic systems are like that, right? So if you're a driver, you can just look down there, you can look 50 feet down the road or 10 feet down the road in low range second or something, and you can say, oh, I'm going to need to intervene like this, and you can intervene back here, whereas an electronic system is unaware of what you've seen, and it's going to take, several seconds to get to where the problem is, and then the problem has to manifest itself, and then the system has to intervene, and there's a feedback mechanism that takes place then. But, if this is why the best system is probably the best driver with the best vehicle, as opposed to, having the way the car industry rolls is that they just assume that the driver's got borderline no training and they design the systems around that. Whereas I think the best systems have the best operators and
But
the
I
best
think
technology.
I think traction controls are designed for those people that have absolutely no skill. Because when I sat in the
Totally.
traction control vehicle and did the old thing, okay, I know that wheel's going to slip now because it's coming right off the ground. It's going to lose traction. What do? I ease the accelerator off a little bit until the wheel comes down firmly on the ground, and then I apply a little bit of juice to make use of that traction. And the traction control said, and stopped. The car
Well,
stopped dead. It
dude,
was the
it's like
worst thing you could possibly do. The only thing you can do is kind of put your foot down and wait for the wheels too. But in those early systems, that's what it was. It made such a hole in the ground, spinning like crazy until the traction control started transferring power and actually breaking that wheel. Later on, the later Land Rover LR4 that I took on a very challenging trip in Lesotho to prove that this new system was very good, and it is very, very good. We had low-profile tires. I'd pumped them up really hard to protect the tires because I was worried that they were going to get split from the rocks and things like this. And I remember close to the end, it was a horrible bank. I had to steer this way against the bank, and it was and I thought, okay, now, and a nice surge of power now. And what did the car do? Went all up over. The rest of the crew started clapping. It's brilliant driving, Andrew. Yeah, me. I did nothing.
brilliant ham-fisted driving, Andrew.
It did it for me. It was brilliant. I've always, so if you, and I saw a video the other day of LR4, again, over very, very twisty ground, lifting the ground, and somebody commented, how do you do that without traction control? Answer, it's a skill set you need to learn, or use traction control and don't really bother too much about the skill sets, because so many of the traction controls are so good that you'll be fine.
Yeah, I still think there's a case for absolutely both. Like, you should be the best driver you can be, and if you're in the best car that you can be in, then it's like Gestalt theory. The two of those things is greater than the sum of their halves, kind of thing, because you can see more than it can see, and it can probably intervene in some situations better than you. Like the classic example of that is the electronic stability program, where if you're driving along and you have one tire rapidly deflate and the car starts to yaw around like this, stability control can do one thing that you can't do, which is it can break individual wheels and keep a car straight. So it's also probably a really good idea if you know to counter steer in that situation, and
do both. Use the electronics to help you out. You do the counter steering and not too much of it, and you probably will get out scot-free.
Yeah. The key thing there, I mean, if you're listening to this podcast and you want an actionable thing you can do in any driving situation where something critical happens, there's a thing called target fixation, where if a kid steps out in front of the car, don't look at the kid. If a kangaroo hops out in the middle of the road and all of a sudden there's insufficient road in which to stop, do not look at the problem. Like, look over here at the solution. Do not fixate on the target, because if you look at the kid or the kangaroo, you'll hit it. Whereas if you look at a solution like playing contact sport, if you're playing football, look for the gap rather than the big, heavy front row forward who's coming in to nail you. Look for a gap, and it's much more likely that you will emerge unscathed in all of these situations. So, avoid the target fixation thing, and it'll probably, you'll stack the deck in your favour. Look at it that way.
Great, John. This has been brilliant. Thank you very much.
Nice to talk to you, Andrew.
It's been fantastic. And yes, as a repeat guest, you can bank on that. Email me with some ideas.
Will do, mate.
Yeah, email me. I got a lot of ideas right now. So the more the merrier. So that's fantastic. You live in. I mean, you see, this is dangerous. If I get this wrong now, I could be machine gunned. You live in Victoria, don't you?
If by Victoria you mean Sydney, then yes.
Of course. I get this too confused. You see, machine gun. That's what it is.
Well, I mean,
so you live quite close to Sydney. Is that
from where you're sitting, like Victoria, New South Wales? It's a technical difference at best, isn't it?
Yeah, except for about beer. We should talk about beer. We should talk about beer. I picked up a Victoria bitter in one of my shows. The vitriol and hatred, unbelievable. And it was a Victoria bitter, which is, don't shoot me, not a terrible beer. I don't particularly like it, but I don't hate it either. We should talk about beer.
All right. I'll make sure I start doing research this evening, and I'll devote myself to that cause until next we speak.
Okay, John. All right. It's been brilliant. Thanks. Thanks, mate. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for watching. Of course, like and subscribe. And if you've enjoyed this, most importantly of all, if you could share it with your friends. See you next time.
I'm a